Washkonas Indijnakas, Makwa Dodam. I'm really happy to be here on unceded Algonquin territory, presenting to you all. What I'm presenting is a paper I wrote about the independent review of Cathedral Valley Group Home. So the Cathedral Valley Group Home was commissioned by the Manitoba Family Services and Consumer Affairs and was produced after a collective effort of former Indigenous group home residents protested against the Manitoba government, claiming they were forced into slavery and suffered physical and sexual and emotional abuse while residing in the group home. Not only were the former Indigenous residents calling for justice, accountability, and compensation, but the former AFN chief, Phil Fontaine, at the time echoed the need for and the importance for an inquiry. Increased pressure on the Manitoba government came after Stan McGilvery camped outside the Winnipeg legislature building for 31 days, which garnered increased attention amongst the media and Indigenous groups. And ultimately led to the province's decision to conduct an independent review on the Cathedral Valley Group Home, and which the report was later based upon that I'm talking to you today. The report led to the subsequent apology by the province, although concluding that some residents benefited from their experience in the group home, and there were other former residents that were harmed emotionally. According to the independent review led by former Provincial Ombudsman of Manitoba, Barry Tuckett, which concluded that perhaps the home was not merely a right fit for some of the children and youth that had resided there, and for those former residents, individual healing plans were said to be made available. This narrative speaks to a very subjective view that situates some Indigenous former residents as contributing to the problem, suggesting that if it were not for their claims of abuse and their participation in the home, no real problem would exist. Although the Cathedral Valley Group Home report provides detailed information on the group home that was in operation during the era of the 60 Scoop, it renders visible the 60 Scoop and the experiences that are attached to such a term. By placing these experiences outside of an era Judge Kimmelin is known to unequivocally recognize as cultural genocide. Furthermore, the report is riddled with misnomers underlying ideologies of racism, which are colonizing and silencing of the Indigenous voice, reinforcing notions of cultural superiority and imperialism. As the former Provincial Ombudsman himself leads the investigation, I have to question who is it that benefits from the messages relayed in the report, what ideologies are being reinforced through the use of certain terms, and what is implicitly excluded. Indigenous children have and continue to be overrepresented within the Canada's child welfare system. Many Indigenous children are placed in the care of social services after the closure of residential schools, and through that they face separation from their families and communities. Some claim to have experienced a loss of language and culture. Many experience a loss of language and culture, actually, and some were traumatized by experiences of exploitation and abuse. This phenomenon is known as the 60 Scoop. The 60 Scoop can be seen as a assimilationist and ongoing form of colonization, according to Sindelair. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples reported that social workers involved in the 60 Scoop believed they were acting in the best interest of Indigenous families by separating children from the parents and extended family. The 60 Scoop has become known as one of the most pervasive procedures impacting Indigenous communities and wide-ranging effects throughout the country. There were more Indigenous children leaving their communities and families than at the height of residential schools, according to a Bomsawin film that's on a diary of Richard Cardinal. Although the Cathedral Valley Group Home was in operation during this time frame, and there were more Indigenous children and youth in the home than non-Indigenous children and youth, the 60 Scoop phenomenon was largely dismissed within the report. By separating the 60 Scoop from the events that were transpiring within the group home, Tuckett decontextualizes the experience that many Indigenous children and youth were facing at that time. The report is then located outside of the realm of the experiences that spoke to a large-scale loss of family and community and culture that echoed issues of racism, exploitation, sexual and physical abuse. The report paints a narrative of Henry Blake, a man who volunteered his time as a scoutmaster, and a person who assists an elderly war veteran by helping him on his farm. Henry purchases land in the late 1960s near Riding Mountain, where he received the assistance of his scout troop to clear land and build the house. Henry Blake and his wife Phyllis operated the group home up until 1977, where she was murdered by one of the Indigenous youth that is known as Resident U. Resident U, in the report, says that he wanted to flee the home. The report shares the experiences of Resident U through the lens of court documents, probation officers, largely documenting the physical abuse he had experienced by Henry Blake and how unhappy he was in the placement. The report, the profile of Resident U is summed up with claims that the placement of the resident in Cathedral Valley was a mistake, that his personality and dissatisfaction led him to bottle up his emotions, resulting in an explosion that led to Phyllis Blake's death. Resident U was sentenced to a secondary life sentence. After the death of Phyllis Blake, Henry Blake remarried, and his second wife, Barb Blake, they continued to operate the home until even after Henry Blake died. The home formally closed in 1983. Although Phyllis Blake had been murdered in Cathedral Valley, an inquiry emerged 30 years later due to pressures from former Indigenous residents from the home. The inquiry into the group home is largely credited to the Warriors of the Lost Boys. In 2008, the province of Manitoba announced it was launching the inquiry into Cathedral Valley, and Barry Tuckett, the former provincial ombudsman of Manitoba, was selected to lead the inquiry from which the report was written. The inquiry concluded with Tuckett requesting supports for some former residents. He says, this review has led me to the conclusion that there remains a need for recognition of the emotional damages suffered by some of the boys, the removal from their families and communities, and resultant feelings they inevitably felt of fear, isolation, abandonment, and loneliness, confusion were exacerbated by their experiences in the home, for which some may have included physical and sexual abuse. There needs to be healing, a process of healing, and a plan to provide it. The report focuses mainly, though, on emotional harms caused to some of the former residents. As Tuckett claims, there's just not enough evidence to substantiate allegations of slave labor, physical or sexual abuse. Based on Tuckett's finding, Gord McIntosh, the Manitoba Minister of Family Services and Consumer Affairs at that time, provided what the Winnipeg Free Press calls a quick apology in 2010 for emotional harms. So some positive features, I think, about the report is that it led to an apology. The inquiry led to an apology and an offer to some for emotional supports. From the report, an apology was made to some of the former Indigenous residents. An apology is a form of acknowledgement that something not quite right happened in that home. Even though that which was seen as not quite right was not fully defined nor addressed. This leads me to question, to what extent, though, does this report acknowledge Indigenous experiences within Cathedral Valley? What is validated through the apology, but more importantly, what is being denied? By all accounts, Henry Blake is characterized as an upstanding Christian white male citizen who volunteers much of his time helping children and gentlemanly elderly war veteran. Henry's image is further validated by extension of his wife, Phyllis Blake, who has had a reputable career as a physiotherapist. All these details come into greater focus and help identify what is deemed as normal versus the periphery of experiences left voiceless. Those participants seemingly rendered raceless throughout the report, as they're labeled as nameless resident A through U. Not only were the names removed, but race was not deemed as a significant factor throughout the report, assuming a colorblind approach, insinuating race doesn't matter. The report does not take into consideration how pervasive colonization, imperialism, and racism has been and continues to be within the lives of Indigenous peoples. The group home was operating at a time known by many as a 60s scoop, when there was an overrepresentation of Indigenous children entering the child welfare system, especially within Manitoba. The former group home residents that claim abuse within Cathedral Valley are Indigenous, and there are other forms of evidence throughout the report that implied that the treatment of Indigenous children and youth by the group home operator was worse than that of the non-Indigenous residents. Many of the former Indigenous children and youth that have attended the home continue to face trauma to this day. And it was even exemplified through the report when the residents were speaking about their experiences. And also it was found that at least 3 of the former residents committed suicide. And that was 3 that they know of. Resident U, who was charged in the killing of the group home operator's wife, was Indigenous. He was not interviewed, nor were his relatives. This leads to a further silencing of the Indigenous survivors' experiences. Similar to the other Indigenous residents who speak of stories of abuse, the onus for such dysfunctional claims of abuse and trauma have been placed on the Indigenous children and youth themselves, thereby insinuating that there must be something wrong with them, ignoring their testimonials and others that would support their claim, while simultaneously refuting and silencing claims that various forms of violence have been occurring in the home. Henry Blake then becomes a man entitled to the land and the full benefits of citizenship. The land can be seen as a metaphor for the Indigenous bodies, and full benefits of citizenship is a realm in which violence has been routinely accepted and excused in the lives of Indigenous peoples. The Cathedral Valley Group Home Report segregates itself from what was transpiring outside of its doors, largely known within the 60 Scoop. Also, the report has proven to de-race identities through its profiling, yet Indigenous residents are situated in spaces of uncredibility. In the next section, I'm going to talk about how Cathedral Valley, the report, chooses to unname and emphasize stereotypes rooted in racist ideology while rendering invisible Indigenous experiences. So the report situates the Indigenous voice as needing certain types of proof in order to be legitimated as an occurrence. It dismisses the experiences of those that have claimed exploitation. And to have an apology only for the emotional abuse kind of leaves out the picture of what these Indigenous former residents were saying. So within the Cathedral Valley Group Home, a variety of individuals were interviewed. Only 9 of the former residents were interviewed, whereas there were 18 external parties and 24 former probation officers and social workers affiliated with the group home that were interviewed. Overwhelmingly, the inquiry relied heavily on the expert witness of social workers and probation officers to corroborate evidence as truthful and dismiss others as not substantive enough. So this is a description of the group home operator. In the report, he had a military background and was heavily involved in the scouting movement throughout his life. Based on interviews with the residents, neighbors, community people, and government employees, one could describe Mr. Blake as a big man with a rough and imposing personality. Some describe Mr. Blake as a John Wayne type of character. Mr. Blake was also described as an overbearing and intimidating man who was a firm believer in strict rules, obedience, discipline, and punishment. It was suggested that Mr. Blake believed that structure, hard work, and discipline were good for the residents in terms of character building. Based on the individual accounts of those who did not reside in the household, Henry Blake was described as having a previous experience in the military and quite active in scouting. Further, he was seen as rough and imposing, but similar to the likes of John Wayne. And much like John Wayne, overbearing, believer in strict rules, discipline, and punishment. He held certain moral values that structure, hard work, and discipline built character. The imagery of Mr. Blake speaks to the iconic, heroic cowboy who is rough around the edges but believes in civility, law, and order. By contrast, the very report investigating the treatment of residents experienced in the home masked their identities by naming them as letters of the alphabet, devoid of any positive character attributes. In Rasparit and Phelps, Indigenous peoples never viewed the land as wild and themselves as wild as. So everybody would concur that Indigenous people never viewed the land as wild and themselves as uncivilized. I think that's pretty. It was not until Hollywood narratives of cowboys and Indians as represented by actors such as John Wayne that Indigenous peoples began to find themselves situated in the civilized savage binary. The Indian in relation to the cowboy becomes distorted, existing in a fictional space outside of the realm of reality, but deeply rooted in racism. LaRocque, in Challenging Frontiers in the Canadian West, says, she speaks to heroification, which promotes the valorization of the cowboy killing the Indian, associating their actions as contributing to the moral, cultural, and racial progress. Distinguishing who is seen to be legitimated by the narrative as it assumes the role of the other as wild or savage. Those claiming abuse represents a space of deviancy as former Indigenous group home residents. Reflected in their experiences were encounters of violence, In order to continue to maintain the benefits of power and imperialism disguised as order and civility, the story then must reassert notions of Indians as savage and cowboys as heroic. The report and inquiry, which was initially meant to investigate former Indigenous residents and abuses suffered at the hand of the group home operators, then transforms, morphing into the narrative surrounding the murder of Phyllis Blake and the horror that the group home residents felt in witnessing its aftermath. Reinterpreting or dismissing the reasons for the inquiry by the Indigenous residents, banishing all Indigenous claims of racialized violence. The group home operators are the victims then, and the Indians maintain their status as villains. Although the report has profiled a number of former residents, there are many others that were not located, as well as many other who have faced similar experiences in other group homes in Manitoba. The report is telling in the forms of knowledges that are legitimated and given space, and others that are devalued, minimized. It is decontextualized and does not confront issues of race, violence, sexual and emotional abuse. And there's a lack of acknowledgement of potential linkages to those Indigenous children and youth that have died as a result of trauma endured. The profiles of the former Indigenous children and youth that reside in Cathedral Valley speak to the dire need for supports, healing, and redress. The Indigenous residents of Cathedral Valley not only faced oppression through their experiences in the home, but were marginalized through the report's privileging of certain types of narratives. By situating the group home outside of the 60 scoop, the reports distorts and decontextualize the realities of what was transpiring on a large scale in the province. By deracing participants' identities through its profile, the report treated all group home residents as equal, as if racism did not exist or play a role in the lives of all the Indigenous residents. Race has and continues to play a major role in what voices are heard, how stories are contextualized, versus how others are rendered invisible. I would also argue that racism was a large contributor to the trauma and exploitation and abuse experienced by the former residents, by the former Indigenous residents. It is important to acknowledge that the trauma inflicted and remember those that have not survived. An apology must find relevant ways of reconciliation and redress that take into consideration the lived experiences of those who have been marginalized. Thank you.